Picture this. You're standing in the shadowy corridors of Versailles in 1785, and you witness something that makes your blood run cold. A nursemaid hurries through the darkness, carrying a bundle that should contain the future heir to the French throne, but whispers follow in her wake because everyone knows the horrifying truth. That bundle might not contain the royal baby at all, and what you're witnessing represents one of the most disturbing conspiracies in European history. Before diving into these forgotten stories of switched identities and stolen crowns, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of royal history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these royal mysteries together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the secrets that shaped empires. What you're about to hear isn't just another tale of palace intrigue. It's the story of how royal succession could be manipulated through the most intimate act of deception imaginable. How innocent babies became pawns in games of power that would reshape the map of Europe, and how some of history's most famous monarchs might not have been royal at all. The practice of swapping royal babies might sound like something from a fairy tale, but the reality was far more sinister and surprisingly common. Royal nurseries were hotbeds of political conspiracy, where a single switched infant could topple dynasties, start wars, or secure the throne for ambitious nobles who understood that controlling the bloodline meant controlling the kingdom itself. Let's start with the most shocking case that would haunt European royalty for centuries. The mystery begins in the opulent chambers of the Palace of Versailles, where Marie Antoinette lay in agony during what should have been her moment of greatest triumph. The year was 1785, and all of France held its breath, waiting for news of the Dauphin's birth. But something went terribly wrong in that delivery room. Something so devastating that it would spawn conspiracy theories lasting well into the modern era. Marie Antoinette wasn't just any queen giving birth. She was the most hated woman in France, blamed for the country's financial ruin and despised by nobles who saw her as a foreign interloper who had corrupted the pure French bloodline. The pressure on her to produce a healthy male heir was crushing, made worse by the fact that her previous pregnancies had been fraught with political implications that threatened the stability of the monarchy itself. The delivery took place in the Queen's chambers, but unlike normal births, this one was witnessed by dozens of courtiers, whose presence was required by royal protocol. These weren't just passive observers. Many of them had political motivations for wanting the birth to succeed or fail, and their proximity to the newborn created opportunities for mischief that would have been impossible in a private setting. Contemporary accounts describe a scene of barely controlled chaos. The Queen's screams echoed through the palace halls while courtiers jockeyed for position to witness the historic moment. Servants scurried back and forth carrying supplies, and in the confusion, something extraordinary happened that would change the course of French history. According to secret documents discovered centuries later in the Vatican archives, the baby born that night was not the healthy prince that France desperately needed. Instead, Marie Antoinette delivered a child so sickly and malformed that court physicians immediately recognized it would never survive to adulthood, let alone rule the most powerful kingdom in Europe. The implications were staggering. If word spread that the Queen had produced a defective heir, it would be seen as divine punishment for the royal family's sins and could trigger the revolution that was already simmering beneath the surface of French society. The monarchy's legitimacy rested on the belief that God blessed royal bloodlines with healthy heirs, and a sickly prince would shatter that fundamental assumption. What happened next reads like something from a political thriller. Within hours of the birth, a conspiracy was hatched involving the highest levels of the French court. The Queen's personal physician, Dr. Lassagne, along with several trusted courtiers, made a decision that would echo through history. They would switch the dying infant with a healthy baby boy whose resemblance to the royal family was close enough to fool even intimate observers. The replacement child was reportedly the son of a minor noble whose wife had given birth on the same night in a village just outside Paris. The family was approached by royal agents who offered them a deal that was impossible to refuse: surrender their healthy son to become the future King of France, and in return, receive enough gold to secure their family's fortune for generations. The alternative, they were told, was far less pleasant. The switch was executed with military precision. The dying royal infant was spirited away to a remote monastery, where he passed away within days, his death carefully concealed from all but the most trusted conspirators. Meanwhile, the healthy peasant child was brought to Versailles under cover of darkness and placed in the royal nursery, where he would grow up believing himself to be the legitimate heir to the French throne. The psychological impact on those involved was devastating. Marie Antoinette, weakened by childbirth and laudanum, was told that her son was healthy and thriving, but court observers noted that she seemed strangely detached from the infant in the weeks following his birth. Some historians suggest she suspected the truth, but was too terrified of the political consequences to voice her concerns. The conspiracy required the silence of dozens of people, from high-ranking nobles to lowly servants who had witnessed various aspects of the switch. This silence was maintained through a combination of generous bribes and terrifying threats. Several individuals who showed signs of wanting to reveal the truth met mysterious deaths in the months following the birth, their bodies found in the Seine with no clear explanation for their demise. The switched prince grew up in the palace, receiving the finest education and preparation for kingship that Europe could provide. He learned languages, studied military strategy, and was groomed to rule over millions of subjects who would never know that their future monarch was actually born in a peasant's cottage rather than a royal bedchamber. But the deception created psychological scars that would manifest in disturbing ways as the false prince matured. Palace observers noted that he displayed behavioral patterns that seemed inconsistent with royal breeding. He was unusually comfortable with servants, showed a surprising knowledge of common folk customs, and occasionally lapsed into dialect that suggested a humble background rather than aristocratic upbringing. The boy's true parents, meanwhile, were relocated to a remote estate where they lived in comfortable exile, forbidden from ever acknowledging their biological son or revealing the truth about his origins. They received regular payments from the royal treasury, but these came with the understanding that any attempt to contact their child or expose the conspiracy would result in immediate execution. As the false prince grew older, the strain of maintaining the deception became increasingly difficult. He began asking questions about his earliest memories, noting inconsistencies in the stories told about his infancy. Court physicians who had been involved in the switch grew nervous as the boy's natural intelligence led him to probe deeper into circumstances surrounding his birth. The conspiracy faced its greatest test when the boy reached adolescence and began displaying physical characteristics that seemed inconsistent with his supposed royal heritage. His bone structure, facial features, and even his voice patterns suggested different genetic origins than those claimed by the official royal genealogy. Palace physicians were forced to concoct increasingly elaborate explanations for these discrepancies, claiming that the prince's unusual appearance was the result of his mother's Austrian bloodline or attributing his behavioral quirks to the influence of foreign tutors. But privately, many courtiers began to suspect that something was fundamentally wrong with the official story of the prince's birth. The political implications of the switch extended far beyond France's borders. European monarchies operated on the principle that royal blood carried special qualities that justified their rule over common people. If it became known that a peasant child could successfully impersonate a prince, it would undermine the entire theoretical foundation of monarchy itself. Foreign intelligence services, particularly those of Austria and Prussia, began investigating rumors about the French succession. They planted spies in the palace, bribed servants for information, and even attempted to steal documents that might reveal the truth about the prince's origins. The French court was forced to maintain an elaborate counterintelligence operation to protect their secret. The financial cost of the conspiracy was enormous. Beyond the initial bribes paid to secure silence, the royal treasury had to fund ongoing payments to numerous individuals who possessed dangerous knowledge. Secret pensions were established for servants, physicians, and nobles who had been involved in the switch, creating a network of dependents whose loyalty was purchased rather than earned. The emotional toll on Marie Antoinette was particularly severe. Letters discovered in private archives reveal that she suffered from persistent nightmares about lost children and frequently woke screaming about babies being stolen from her arms. Her relationship with the false prince was strained by an underlying tension that she could never fully explain, even to herself. The conspiracy also created a culture of suspicion and paranoia within the royal court. Courtiers began to wonder what other secrets were being concealed, and trust between even long-time allies began to erode. The palace became a place where whispered conversations stopped when strangers approached, where servants were constantly watched for signs of disloyalty, and where the truth became a luxury that few could afford. As revolution began brewing in the streets of Paris, the switched prince found himself in an impossible position. He was being groomed to rule a kingdom that was rejecting the very concept of monarchy, and he was doing so under an identity that was fundamentally fraudulent. The weight of this deception would soon contribute to the collapse of the entire French royal system. The boy who would grow up to face the guillotine during the French Revolution might never have known that he was dying for a crown that wasn't rightfully his, representing a bloodline that wasn't his own, and paying the ultimate price for a conspiracy that had robbed him of his true identity from the moment of his birth. This is just the beginning of our journey into the dark world of royal baby swapping, where innocent children became casualties of political ambition and entire kingdoms were built on foundations of deception that would crumble under the weight of their own lies. The ripple effects of this French deception would spread across Europe like a plague, inspiring copycat conspiracies that would shake the foundations of monarchy itself. But before we explore how this twisted practice evolved, we need to understand the mechanism that made such switches possible in the first place. The answer lies in the bizarre world of royal childbirth, where privacy was considered treason and intimacy was a public spectacle. Royal births weren't private affairs between husband and wife. They were state ceremonies requiring the presence of dozens of witnesses whose job was to verify the legitimacy of the heir. This meant that the most vulnerable moment in any royal couple's life became a theatrical performance where political enemies could observe, judge, and potentially interfere with the very survival of the dynasty. The Palace of Versailles had perfected this system of public birthing to an art form that bordered on the grotesque. When a queen went into labour, bells would ring throughout the palace, summoning courtiers who were required by law to witness the delivery. These weren't medical professionals or trusted family members. They were political rivals, foreign ambassadors, and ambitious nobles who had their own reasons for wanting the birth to succeed or fail spectacularly. Imagine being in excruciating pain while dozens of strangers crowd around your bed, taking notes on your screams, timing your contractions, and whispering about the political implications of your suffering. This wasn't just medieval barbarism. This was calculated policy designed to prevent exactly the kind of baby swapping that was about to become commonplace across European courts. But the system created as many opportunities for deception as it prevented. The chaos of a royal delivery, with servants rushing in and out, physicians shouting orders, and courtiers jockeying for better viewing positions, provided perfect cover for those brave enough to attempt the ultimate act of royal fraud. The technology of deception was surprisingly sophisticated. Professional baby swappers, known in court circles as nursery artists, developed techniques that would make modern identity thieves envious. They studied the facial features of royal infants, noting distinctive birthmarks, unusual proportions, and genetic characteristics that would need to be replicated in any replacement child. These specialists maintained networks of informants who monitored pregnant women throughout royal territories, identifying potential replacement babies whose appearance might fool even intimate observers. When a suitable candidate was located, the family would be approached with offers that combined incredible wealth with absolutely terrifying consequences for refusal. The most successful nursery artists were often women who had served as wet nurses in multiple royal households. Their intimate knowledge of palace routines, combined with their access to newborn infants, made them invaluable to conspirators plotting dynastic coups. These women understood the rhythms of royal nurseries, knew which servants could be bribed, and possessed the medical knowledge necessary to execute a successful switch. One such woman, known only as Madame Dubois in encrypted court documents, was reportedly responsible for at least 7 successful royal baby swaps across 3 different kingdoms. Her techniques were so refined that she could perform a complete infant substitution in under 10 minutes, leaving no physical evidence of the deception. Madame Dubois operated what amounted to an underground railroad for royal babies, maintaining safe houses where switched infants could be hidden until permanent arrangements were made. Her network included physicians who would falsify medical records, wet nurses who would care for displaced children, and even forgers who could create convincing documentation of false identities. The psychological profiles of replacement babies were as important as their physical characteristics. Nursery artists learned to identify infants whose temperaments would be compatible with royal upbringing, avoiding children whose natural dispositions might betray their humble origins as they matured. But the most disturbing aspect of this trade was what happened to the original royal babies who were displaced. In most cases, these legitimate heirs were quietly eliminated to prevent future complications. The methods were usually subtle, designed to appear as natural infant mortality that was tragically common in that era. Some displaced princes and princesses were kept alive, but raised in ignorance of their true identities. These children grew up as peasants or minor nobles, never knowing that they were rightfully entitled to thrones that had been stolen from them in their first days of life. Their descendants might still be alive today, carrying royal blood while living ordinary lives, completely unaware of their extraordinary heritage. The financial implications of royal baby swapping were staggering. A successful switch could redirect the wealth of entire nations into the hands of conspirators who controlled the false heir. Royal treasuries that should have supported legitimate dynasties instead funded the elaborate deceptions necessary to maintain fraudulent successions. Insurance policies were developed by wealthy nobles who wanted to protect their investments in particular royal lines. If a favored prince died or was revealed to be illegitimate, these policies would compensate the investors for their losses. This created a perverse financial incentive for baby swapping, where the death or displacement of royal infants became profitable transactions rather than personal tragedies. The most sophisticated conspiracies involved multiple layers of deception designed to confuse even the conspirators themselves. A single royal baby might be switched several times, creating a chain of substitution so complex that no individual participant could expose the entire operation without implicating themselves in treason. These elaborate schemes required precise timing and military-level coordination. Messages had to be passed between conspirators using codes that changed daily. Safe houses had to be prepared with wet nurses who could care for multiple infants simultaneously. Transportation routes had to be secured to move babies quickly between locations without detection. The psychological impact on the switched children themselves was profound and lasting. Many of these false heirs developed identity disorders that manifested in disturbing ways as they matured. They struggled with feelings of not belonging, experienced nightmares about lost families, and sometimes displayed behavioral patterns that seemed inconsistent with their supposed royal breeding. Palace physicians learned to recognize the symptoms of what they privately called substitution syndrome. Affected children would compulsively seek out servants rather than nobles for comfort, display unusual knowledge of common folk customs, and sometimes speak in dialects that suggested humble origins rather than aristocratic upbringing. The treatment for these symptoms involved elaborate conditioning programs designed to suppress the child's natural instincts and replace them with behaviors appropriate to their assumed royal status. These programs bordered on psychological torture involving isolation, punishment for inappropriate behaviors, and constant reinforcement of false memories about their origins. Meanwhile, the biological parents of switched children faced their own unique psychological hell. They were forced to watch strangers raise their biological children while knowing that any attempt to reveal the truth would result in immediate execution. Many of these parents developed severe mental illness, unable to cope with the impossible situation they found themselves trapped within. The networks of silence surrounding royal baby swaps created entire communities bound together by shared guilt and mutual dependence. Servants who had witnessed switches, physicians who had falsified records, and nobles who had participated in conspiracies all became part of extended criminal families whose survival depended on maintaining collective lies. These communities developed their own languages, rituals, and social hierarchies based on the level of dangerous knowledge each member possessed. The most valuable individuals were those who had direct knowledge of multiple switches, making them simultaneously the most powerful and most vulnerable members of the conspiracy. The geographic scope of royal baby swapping was truly international. Professional nursery artists travelled between courts, offering their services to the highest bidders and creating connections between seemingly unrelated dynastic frauds. A single conspiracy might involve Swiss bankers, Italian physicians, German wet nurses, and English forgers, all working together to deceive multiple royal families simultaneously. Communication between these international networks required sophisticated encryption techniques that predated modern cryptography by centuries. Messages were hidden in seemingly innocent diplomatic correspondence, embedded in artistic works, and even encoded in the arrangements of flowers delivered to royal gardens. The most successful baby swapping operations were those that operated over multiple generations, creating false dynasties that could maintain their deceptions for decades or even centuries. These long-term conspiracies required incredible patience, careful planning, and the ability to pass dangerous knowledge from one generation of conspirators to the next without detection. But every conspiracy, no matter how carefully planned, contained the seeds of its own destruction. The psychological pressure of maintaining such elaborate deceptions inevitably created cracks in the facade that observant enemies could exploit. When those cracks finally split open, the consequences would be more devastating than anyone could have imagined. The stage was being set for revelations that would not only expose individual cases of baby swapping, but would call into question the legitimacy of entire royal bloodlines that had ruled Europe for generations. The children who had been switched were growing up, and some of them were beginning to ask very dangerous questions about their true origins. The revelation that would shatter European monarchy came from the most unlikely source imaginable. In 1789, as revolution consumed France, a dying woman in a remote convent clutched the hand of a priest and whispered secrets that would rewrite the history books forever. Her name was Sister Marguerite, and she had once been the most trusted nursemaid in the Palace of Versailles. What she revealed on her deathbed wasn't just about the French royal baby swap we've already discussed. It was far worse. Sister Marguerite had been part of an international conspiracy that had been switching royal babies across Europe for over 30 years. The practice had become so systematic, so widespread, that she estimated at least 12 major European royal lines were now ruled by complete impostors. The priest who heard her confession was so horrified by what he learned that he immediately sealed her testimony in the Vatican archives, where it remained hidden for over 2 centuries. But the damage was already done. Sister Marguerite's revelations would spark a chain of investigations that would expose the true scope of royal baby swapping and reveal just how far the conspiracy had spread. Let me paint you a picture of what Europe looked like in 1789 from Sister Marguerite's perspective. She had personally participated in switches involving the royal families of France, Spain, Austria, Prussia, and even England. The babies who should have been legitimate heirs were either dead or living as peasants, while the thrones of Europe were occupied by children, whose only qualification for rule was that they happened to resemble the royal bloodline closely enough to fool casual observers. The Spanish case was particularly shocking because it involved not just one switch, but an entire series of substitutions that had been carried out over 3 generations. The House of Bourbon in Spain had been infiltrated so thoroughly that by 1789 there wasn't a single legitimate royal left in the entire dynasty. Every prince, every princess, every potential heir was actually the descendant of carefully selected peasant children who had been groomed from birth to impersonate nobility. This wasn't just about individual acts of deception. This was systematic replacement of entire bloodlines, carried out by a network of conspirators who understood that controlling royal succession meant controlling the future of European civilization itself. The implications were staggering, and the methods used to achieve this level of infiltration were more sophisticated than anything we've seen so far. The Spanish operation began in 1759, when King Charles III ascended to the throne. Unknown to the Spanish people, Charles himself was already a replacement, switched as an infant when the legitimate heir died of smallpox. But the conspirators didn't stop there. They recognized that a single false king could still be exposed if legitimate relatives existed who might challenge his claim. So they systematically replaced the entire extended royal family. Over the course of 30 years, every birth in the Spanish royal household was monitored by the conspiracy. Healthy babies were switched with carefully selected replacements, while the original royal children were either eliminated or relocated to remote areas where they would never pose a threat to the false dynasty. The level of planning required for this operation was extraordinary. The conspirators maintained detailed genealogical records that tracked not just the official royal family tree, but also the true bloodlines of all the replacement children. They needed to ensure that marriages between false royals wouldn't accidentally unite children who were actually biological siblings, as this would create genetic problems that might expose the entire deception. The financial resources required were equally staggering. The Spanish treasury was secretly funding an elaborate network of safe houses, bribed officials, and professional baby swappers that stretched across multiple continents. Ships were dispatched to the New World, carrying Spanish gold specifically earmarked for maintaining the conspiracy, while trusted agents in the Americas identified potential replacement children among the colonial populations. But the Spanish operation was just one tentacle of a much larger conspiracy that had its roots in the most unlikely place imaginable, the Vatican itself. Sister Marguerite's confession revealed that the Catholic Church had been secretly orchestrating royal baby swaps for decades, using its unique position as confessor to European royalty to identify opportunities for dynastic manipulation. The Vatican's motivations were complex and deeply disturbing. On one level, church leaders were genuinely concerned about the genetic deterioration they observed in European royal families. Centuries of inbreeding had produced monarchs who were increasingly unstable, both physically and mentally. and church officials worried that this decline was undermining the divine right of kings that formed the theoretical foundation of Catholic political authority. But there was a darker motivation as well. By controlling the true identities of European monarchs, the Church could manipulate international politics in ways that would have been impossible through traditional diplomatic channels. A king who owed his throne to Vatican intervention was a king who would be eternally grateful to Church authorities, creating a level of papal influence that hadn't existed since the medieval period. The Vatican's baby swapping operations were coordinated through a secret organization known only as the Nursery of Peter. This group operated with papal authority but maintained complete secrecy, even from most church officials. Its members included some of the most powerful cardinals in Rome, along with a network of agents who had infiltrated royal courts across Europe. The Nursery of Peter had developed techniques for royal baby swapping that were centuries ahead of their time. They maintained detailed medical records of royal pregnancies, tracking everything from the mother's health to the expected date of delivery. When a royal birth was imminent, Vatican agents would position themselves in the area with carefully selected replacement babies who had been prepared for months in advance. The selection process for replacement babies was incredibly sophisticated. The Vatican maintained orphanages specifically for this purpose, where children were raised from infancy to display the mannerisms and characteristics appropriate to royal breeding. These institutions were disguised as regular church orphanages, but their true purpose was to create a steady supply of potential royal substitutes. The psychological conditioning of these replacement children was particularly disturbing. From the moment they could walk and talk, they were taught to believe they were special, chosen by God for a great destiny. They received educations that rivaled those of legitimate princes, learning languages, military strategy, and statecraft. By the time they were selected for a royal switch, they genuinely believed they deserved to rule. The most successful of these Vatican-sponsored switches involved the Austrian royal family, where the conspiracy managed to place 3 consecutive false emperors on the throne without detection. The operation was so sophisticated that even the switched children themselves didn't know their true origins until they were adults, and by then they were so invested in their royal identities that they willingly participated in maintaining the deception. The Austrian case revealed another disturbing aspect of the Vatican's operations. They were using royal baby swapping as a tool for religious warfare. The legitimate Austrian heirs who were displaced were secretly raised as Protestant heretics, creating a generation of potential claimants to the throne who could never be accepted by the Catholic population. This ensured that even if the switches were discovered, the true heirs could never successfully challenge the false dynasty. Meanwhile, the replacement children were raised as devout Catholics whose loyalty to the Church was absolute. This created a generation of European monarchs who were essentially papal puppets, implementing policies that served Vatican interests rather than the needs of their own people. The English case was perhaps the most audacious of all Vatican operations because it involved switching a baby who would grow up to become one of the most powerful monarchs in European history. The child who would eventually rule as a beloved English king was actually the son of an Irish peasant who had been selected for the switch because of his remarkable resemblance to the royal bloodline. The English operation required unprecedented levels of coordination because the Protestant establishment was naturally suspicious of Catholic influence. Vatican agents had to infiltrate the English court through a network of secret Catholic sympathizers who had managed to maintain their positions despite religious persecution. The switch itself took place during a carefully orchestrated crisis that provided perfect cover for the deception. While the English court was distracted by a manufactured political scandal, Vatican agents executed a baby swap so seamless that even the child's own parents never suspected what had happened. The psychological impact on the false English king was profound and lasting. Throughout his reign, he displayed behavioral patterns that seemed inconsistent with his supposed royal breeding. He was unusually sympathetic to Irish concerns, showed surprising knowledge of Catholic theology, and occasionally lapsed into Irish dialect when he was under stress or speaking privately with trusted advisors. But the most disturbing aspect of the English operation was what happened to the legitimate heir. Unlike other cases where displaced royal children were eliminated, the true English prince was kept alive and raised in Ireland as a Catholic peasant. Vatican agents monitored his development for decades, maintaining detailed records of his life and ensuring that he never learned his true identity. The Vatican's long-term plan was to eventually reveal the truth about the switch, using the legitimate heir as a weapon to force the false king to submit to papal authority. If the English monarchy ever became too independent or too hostile to Catholic interests, the Church could produce the true heir and threaten to expose the entire deception. This created a situation where the false king was essentially being blackmailed by the very organisation that had put him on the throne. Every major policy decision had to be evaluated, not just for its impact on England, but for its potential to anger Vatican authorities, who possessed the power to destroy his entire dynasty with a single revelation. The financial cost of maintaining these multiple international conspiracies was staggering. Vatican records show that by 1789, the Church was spending more on baby-swapping operations than on all of its missionary activities combined. Secret accounts were established in banks across Europe, funded by donations from Catholics who had no idea their money was being used to manipulate royal succession. The network of silence required to maintain these operations involved thousands of people across multiple countries. Priests who had heard confessions about baby swaps, servants who had witnessed switches, physicians who had falsified medical records, and nobles who had participated in conspiracies, all became part of an extended criminal organization, whose survival depended on collective secrecy. The psychological toll on these conspirators was enormous. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe anxiety disorders, unable to cope with the constant fear of discovery. Suicide rates among Vatican baby-swapping agents were significantly higher than in the general population, and those who survived often suffered from persistent nightmares and paranoid delusions. The most tragic victims were the displaced royal children themselves. Those who were allowed to live grew up with persistent feelings that something was fundamentally wrong with their lives. They experienced identity crises that they couldn't explain, felt disconnected from their supposed families, and often displayed behavioral patterns that seemed inconsistent with their assumed backgrounds. Some of these displaced children developed an almost supernatural ability to recognize other victims of baby swapping. They would encounter individuals in various social settings and instinctively sense that these people, like themselves, were living false identities. This created informal networks of switched children who provided emotional support for each other without ever explicitly acknowledging what they had in common. The medical complications of maintaining these deceptions were also significant. Vatican physicians had to develop new techniques for disguising the genetic differences between royal families and their replacement children. They created elaborate theories about how traumatic births could alter facial features, how childhood illnesses could affect physical development, and how foreign tutors could influence speech patterns. These medical deceptions became so sophisticated that they began to influence legitimate medical practice. Physicians across Europe started adopting Vatican techniques for explaining genetic inconsistencies, not realizing that these methods had been developed specifically to conceal baby-swapping operations. The international intelligence implications were equally disturbing. Foreign governments that suspected baby-swapping operations began developing their own counterintelligence programs designed to identify and exploit these deceptions. Diplomatic marriages became exercises in genetic espionage, where potential brides and grooms were secretly examined for signs that they might be impostors. The most successful of these counterintelligence operations was run by the Ottoman Empire, which had been largely immune to Vatican baby swapping because of its different religious structure. Ottoman agents infiltrated European courts and compiled detailed dossiers on suspected false royals, using this information to manipulate European politics in ways that served Turkish interests. The Ottomans discovered that many of the European monarchs they were negotiating with were actually peasant children who had been switched at birth. This knowledge gave them enormous leverage in diplomatic negotiations, as they could threaten to expose these deceptions if European powers became too aggressive in their dealings with the Ottoman Empire. By 1789, the entire European political system was built on a foundation of lies so elaborate that even the conspirators themselves had begun to lose track of which royals were legitimate and which were impostors. The Vatican's Nursery of Peter had created a situation where the very concept of a royal bloodline had become meaningless, replaced by a system where political power was determined by whoever was most skilled at maintaining elaborate deceptions. The French Revolution would expose some of these deceptions, but it would also create new opportunities for baby swapping as established royal families fled into exile and new political structures emerged. The chaos of revolution provided perfect cover for the most audacious royal baby swaps in European history. Operations that would reshape the continent in ways that their architects never imagined. The children who had been switched were now adults, and some of them were beginning to piece together the truth about their origins. The psychological pressure of maintaining false identities for decades was creating cracks in the elaborate facades that had been constructed around them. When those facades finally crumbled, the revelations would be more shocking than anything Europe had ever witnessed. But the Vatican's operations were just the beginning. As word of Sister Marguerite's confession began to spread through underground networks, other conspiracies started to emerge from the shadows. The baby swapping epidemic was about to reach its peak, and the consequences would reshape European civilization in ways that are still being felt today. The most disturbing revelation was yet to come. Some of the switched children had grown up and started families of their own, creating entire dynasties built on foundations of deception. Their children and grandchildren carried royal titles and wielded political power, while having no legitimate claim to either. The genetic chaos created by decades of systematic baby swapping had created a situation where the very concept of royal bloodline had become a fiction that everyone agreed to maintain because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. The revolution that would expose these conspiracies began not with grand political upheavals, but with a single terrified scream that echoed through the corridors of Windsor Castle on a fog-shrouded morning in 1788. The woman who screamed was Lady Catherine Pemberton, and what she had discovered in the royal nursery would unravel 3 centuries of carefully constructed lies about the English succession. Lady Catherine wasn't supposed to be in the nursery that morning. She had been suffering from insomnia, a condition that had plagued her since her own infant son had died mysteriously 6 months earlier. Unable to sleep, she had wandered the castle corridors and found herself drawn to the royal nursery where the future King of England lay sleeping in his golden crib. What she saw there made her blood turn to ice. The baby in the crib bore an unmistakable birthmark on his shoulder, a distinctive crescent-shaped mark that she recognized immediately. It was identical to the birthmark her own dead son had carried, a mark so unusual that the palace physicians had specifically noted it in their medical records. But that wasn't the most shocking part of her discovery. As Lady Catherine leaned closer to examine the sleeping infant, she noticed something else that made her heart race with terror. The baby's facial features, his bone structure, even the way his tiny fingers curled in sleep, were identical to her deceased child. This wasn't just a similar birthmark. This was her son lying in the royal crib. The implications hit her like a physical blow. Her child hadn't died of natural causes as she had been told. He had been murdered, and his body had been used to stage the death of the legitimate royal heir. The baby she was looking at was an impostor, carefully selected to replace the true prince, while her own son had been sacrificed to maintain the deception. Lady Catherine's discovery would have remained a private tragedy if not for what happened next. As she stood frozen in horror, staring at the baby who should have been her own, she heard footsteps approaching the nursery. Hidden behind a tapestry, she watched as two figures entered the room, their conversation revealing the true scope of the conspiracy she had stumbled upon. The first figure was Dr. Francis Willis, the king's personal physician, a man whose reputation for discretion was matched only by his skill at manipulating medical records. The second was someone Lady Catherine recognized but had never seen in the royal nursery before, Cardinal Alessandro Albani, the Pope's personal representative to the English court. Their conversation was conducted in whispers, but Lady Catherine's position behind the tapestry allowed her to hear every word. What she learned in those 10 minutes would haunt her for the rest of her life and provide the key to understanding the true extent of Vatican involvement in English royal succession. Dr. Willis was reporting on the progress of what he called the substitution protocol. He explained that the switched infant was adapting well to his new environment, showing no signs of the behavioral problems that had plagued previous operations. The baby's wet nurse had been carefully selected from a pool of candidates who had been psychologically evaluated for their ability to maintain absolute secrecy. Cardinal Albani's response revealed the international scope of the conspiracy. He spoke of similar operations in France, Spain, and Austria, describing a coordinated effort to place Vatican-controlled monarchs on every major European throne. The English operation was apparently the most challenging because of the Protestant establishment's natural suspicion of Catholic influence. But the most chilling part of their conversation concerned the fate of the legitimate royal heir. Cardinal Albani explained that the true prince had been relocated to a monastery in Ireland, where he would be raised as a Catholic peasant. The Vatican's long-term plan was to eventually reveal his true identity, using him as leverage to force England back into the Catholic fold. The psychological conditioning of the replacement baby was equally disturbing. Dr. Willis described a program of subtle manipulation designed to make the false prince naturally sympathetic to Catholic interests. The child's tutors would be carefully selected Vatican agents who would gradually introduce pro-Catholic ideas into his education. His wet nurse had been chosen specifically because she was a secret Catholic who would sing Catholic hymns as lullabies. Lady Catherine listened in growing horror as the two men discussed the murder of her son, with the casual indifference of people discussing the weather. Dr. Willis explained that her child had been selected for elimination because his unusual birthmark made him a perfect candidate for staging the death of the legitimate heir. The baby's death had been carefully orchestrated to appear natural, while his body was used to convince the royal family that their son had died of infant fever. The financial arrangements were equally shocking. Cardinal Albani revealed that the Vatican had been funding English baby swapping operations for over 50 years, using money donated by Catholics who believed their contributions were supporting missionary work. The Church had established secret accounts in London banks managed by English Catholics who were completely unaware of the fund's true purpose. The network of conspirators was more extensive than Lady Catherine had ever imagined. The operation involved not just Vatican agents and corrupt physicians, but also high-ranking English nobles who had been secretly converted to Catholicism. These individuals used their positions at court to facilitate baby swaps, providing access to royal nurseries and advance warning of potential obstacles to the conspiracy. The most disturbing revelation concerned the scope of the deception. Cardinal Albani explained that the English royal family had been systematically infiltrated for 3 generations. The current king himself was a replacement, switched as an infant when the legitimate heir died of smallpox. His children were also impostors, carefully selected peasant children who had been groomed from birth to impersonate nobility. This meant that the entire English royal line was fraudulent, ruled by a dynasty of peasant children who had been conditioned to believe they were divinely appointed monarchs. The psychological implications were staggering. These false royals were governing millions of people while living completely fabricated identities, their every decision influenced by Vatican agents who had shaped their worldview from infancy. The conversation between Dr. Willis and Cardinal Albani also revealed the methods used to maintain these deceptions over multiple generations. The Vatican had developed sophisticated techniques for selecting replacement children who would physically mature in ways that were consistent with their assumed royal identities. They maintained detailed genetic records of European royal families, using this information to identify peasant children whose bone structure and facial features would develop along similar lines. The psychological conditioning of these replacement children was equally sophisticated. From the moment they were selected for royal switches, they were subjected to intensive training programs designed to erase their original identities and replace them with aristocratic personas. They were taught to speak in upper-class accents, to carry themselves with noble bearing, and to display the cultural knowledge expected of royal breeding. But the most insidious aspect of the conditioning was the way it created genuine belief in the children's royal status. The Vatican had learned that the most convincing impostors were those who genuinely believed they were legitimate royals. So the replacement children were subjected to elaborate psychological manipulation, designed to make them completely convinced of their noble birth. This conditioning process took years to complete and required the services of specialists who had been trained in techniques that bordered on psychological torture. The children were isolated from their original families, subjected to constant reinforcement of their false identities, and punished severely for any behavior that suggested they remembered their peasant origins. The financial cost of maintaining these operations was staggering. Lady Catherine learned that the Vatican was spending more on English baby swapping operations than the entire annual budget of most European kingdoms. The money was used not just for bribes and operational expenses, but also for maintaining elaborate cover stories that could withstand investigation by suspicious courtiers. The network of safe houses required to support these operations stretched across multiple countries. Switched infants were frequently moved between locations to prevent them from forming attachments that might compromise their conditioning. The Vatican maintained secret facilities in Ireland, Scotland, and even the American colonies, where displaced royal children could be hidden indefinitely. The most tragic victims were the legitimate royal heirs who were displaced by these operations. Lady Catherine learned that most of these children were eliminated immediately after the switches, their deaths carefully staged to appear natural. But some were kept alive and raised in complete ignorance of their true identities, creating a generation of peasant-raised princes who would never know they were entitled to thrones. The psychological impact on the families of murdered children was equally devastating. Parents like Lady Catherine were forced to grieve for children who had been murdered for political purposes, while being told that their losses were natural tragedies. Many of these parents developed severe mental illness, unable to cope with grief that was complicated by their unconscious awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with the official explanations for their children's deaths. The conversation between Dr. Willis and Cardinal Albani also revealed the international intelligence implications of these operations. Foreign governments that suspected baby swapping were developing their own counterintelligence programs, trying to identify and exploit these deceptions for their own political advantage. The result was a complex web of espionage and counter-espionage that made European diplomacy increasingly dangerous and unpredictable. The most successful counterintelligence operation was apparently being run by the French, who had identified several English nobles as Vatican agents and were using this information to manipulate English foreign policy. The French had discovered that many of the English courtiers involved in diplomatic negotiations were actually working for the Vatican, creating opportunities for manipulations that the French were exploiting ruthlessly. The Dutch had developed their own approach to the problem, establishing a network of agents who specialized in identifying switched royal children. These agents used techniques that combined physical examination with psychological evaluation, looking for signs that individuals might be living false identities. The Dutch were apparently planning to use this information to destabilize European royal families that posed threats to Dutch commercial interests. The most disturbing aspect of the international intelligence war was the way it was affecting legitimate royal families. Monarchs who were actually born to their thrones were being subjected to constant scrutiny and suspicion, their every action analyzed for signs that they might be impostors. This created a climate of paranoia that was making effective governance increasingly difficult. Lady Catherine's discovery of the conspiracy would have remained a private horror if not for what happened when Dr. Willis and Cardinal Albani finished their conversation and prepared to leave the nursery. As they walked past the tapestry where she was hiding, Cardinal Albani stopped suddenly and looked directly at her hiding place. His eyes met hers through the fabric, and she realized with terror that he had known she was there the entire time. What followed was a conversation that would change the course of European history. Cardinal Albani didn't threaten Lady Catherine or attempt to silence her through violence. Instead, he made her an offer that was both generous and terrifying. He would arrange for her murdered son to be returned to her, alive and healthy, if she would agree to serve as a Vatican agent within the English court. The revelation that her son was actually still alive nearly drove Lady Catherine to madness. Cardinal Albani explained that the Vatican had perfected techniques for faking infant deaths that were so sophisticated they could fool even the most skilled physicians. Her son had been drugged to appear dead, then spirited away to a Vatican facility where he had been raised by Catholic nuns. The psychological manipulation was exquisite in its cruelty. Cardinal Albani showed Lady Catherine a recent portrait of her son, now 6 months older and thriving in Vatican care. The child was healthy, happy, and being raised with all the advantages that Vatican resources could provide. But he would remain forever beyond her reach unless she agreed to serve the conspiracy that had stolen him. The choice Cardinal Albani presented was impossible. Lady Catherine could expose the conspiracy and lose her son forever, or she could become complicit in the deception that had murdered dozens of innocent children. The Vatican had essentially made her son a hostage to ensure her cooperation, while offering her a level of access to him that would make her emotionally dependent on maintaining the conspiracy. The psychological torture of this situation was designed to break Lady Catherine's will and transform her into a willing participant in the very system that had victimized her. The Vatican had learned that the most effective agents were those who had been given powerful personal reasons to maintain the conspiracy, even when they morally opposed its methods. Lady Catherine's decision would determine not just her own fate, but the future of the English monarchy itself. If she chose to expose the conspiracy, she would trigger a revelation that would destroy the legitimacy of the entire royal system. If she chose to protect her son, she would become part of a deception that was reshaping European civilization in ways that no one fully understood. The moment stretched out endlessly as Lady Catherine stared at the portrait of her son and realized that there was no choice that wouldn't destroy everything she loved. The Vatican had created a situation where every possible decision would result in tragedy, ensuring that she would become a willing participant in maintaining the very conspiracy that had victimized her. Cardinal Albani waited patiently while Lady Catherine struggled with the impossible choice. His expression was not cruel or mocking. but rather showed the weary resignation of someone who had orchestrated similar scenes many times before. He understood that the psychological pressure he was applying was fundamentally inhumane, but he also believed that the larger goals of the conspiracy justified any amount of individual suffering. The baby in the royal crib continued sleeping peacefully, unaware that his entire identity was a carefully constructed lie, and that his presence in that nursery had been purchased with the blood of innocent children. The future King of England was actually the son of Irish peasants, conditioned from birth to believe he was divinely appointed to rule over millions of people who would never know they were being governed by an impostor. The tapestry behind which Lady Catherine was hiding had been woven with scenes of biblical betrayal, depicting Judas kissing Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. The irony was not lost on her as she realized that she was about to become either a betrayer or a victim, with no possibility of remaining innocent in a world where the Vatican had made innocence itself a luxury that no one could afford. Her decision would echo through the centuries, affecting not just the English royal family, but the entire concept of legitimate government in Europe. The child sleeping in the royal crib would grow up to make decisions that would shape the fate of nations, never knowing that his authority rested on a foundation of deception that had cost the lives of dozens of innocent children. The conspiracy that had started with individual acts of baby swapping had evolved into something far more dangerous. A systematic replacement of European civilization itself, where the very concept of legitimate authority had been replaced by elaborate theatrical performances maintained through psychological manipulation and the threat of violence against innocent children. Lady Catherine's trembling hand reached toward the portrait of her son, and in that moment of hesitation, Cardinal Albani revealed something that would shatter her understanding of the conspiracy entirely. The baby-swapping operations weren't just about political control or religious manipulation. They were part of something far more sinister, a systematic experiment in human breeding that had been conducted across European royal families for over a century. The Vatican's true goal wasn't simply to place Catholic sympathizers on Protestant thrones. It was to create an entirely new form of human being, a genetically engineered aristocracy that would combine the best physical and mental characteristics of peasant stock with the refined cultural conditioning of royal education. The switched children weren't random selections. They were the products of careful genetic planning that would have impressed modern scientists. Cardinal Albani explained that the Vatican had been secretly maintaining detailed breeding records for European peasant families, tracking bloodlines across multiple generations to identify children who possess specific desirable traits. Intelligence, physical beauty, resistance to disease, and psychological stability were all factors that influenced selection decisions. The goal was to create a master race of false royals who would be superior to the inbred degenerates they were replacing. The revelation hit Lady Catherine like a physical blow. Her son hadn't been murdered randomly. He had been selected for elimination because his genetic profile made him unsuitable for the Vatican's breeding program. The unusual birthmark that had helped her identify him was actually considered a genetic flaw that disqualified him from serving as a replacement royal. His death had been predetermined by Vatican geneticists who viewed human children as experimental subjects rather than individual souls deserving of protection. The scope of the genetic manipulation was staggering. Cardinal Albani revealed that the Vatican had been operating secret breeding facilities across Europe, where carefully selected peasant women were impregnated by men chosen specifically for their genetic contributions to the program. The resulting children were raised from birth in controlled environments where their physical and psychological development could be monitored and optimized. These breeding facilities were disguised as convents and monasteries, allowing the Vatican to conduct its experiments without attracting attention from secular authorities. The women who participated were told they were serving God by providing children for church orphanages, never knowing that their babies were being groomed to replace legitimate royal heirs. The psychological conditioning programs were even more sophisticated than Lady Catherine had imagined. The Vatican had developed techniques for personality modification that could transform peasant children into convincing aristocrats within a matter of years. These techniques involved not just education and behavioral training, but also chemical treatments that could alter brain chemistry and even surgical procedures that could modify facial features. The most disturbing aspect of these programs was their success rate. Cardinal Albani claimed that over 90% of the switched children had successfully integrated into their false royal identities without detection. The remaining 10% had been eliminated when they showed signs of psychological instability or physical characteristics that might expose the deception. The financial resources required for these operations were almost beyond comprehension. The Vatican was essentially funding a parallel European aristocracy, maintaining thousands of individuals whose entire existence was dedicated to supporting the baby-swapping conspiracy. The cost included not just the obvious expenses of bribes and operational funding, but also the enormous infrastructure required to maintain the breeding facilities and conditioning programs. The international scope of the conspiracy was equally staggering. Cardinal Albani revealed that similar operations were being conducted in the Americas, where Spanish and Portuguese colonial authorities were using Vatican techniques to create false royal bloodlines among indigenous populations. The goal was to establish Catholic-controlled monarchies that would eventually declare independence from European powers, while remaining loyal to Vatican interests. The most shocking revelation concerned the ultimate goal of the entire conspiracy. The Vatican wasn't just trying to control European politics through baby swapping. They were attempting to create a new form of human civilization where the distinction between noble and peasant blood would become meaningless, because all royal bloodlines would be artificially constructed through genetic manipulation and psychological conditioning. This vision of the future was simultaneously utopian and terrifying. In the Vatican's imagined world, monarchy would be based on scientific selection rather than hereditary accident, creating rulers who were genuinely superior to their subjects in measurable ways. But achieving this vision required the systematic murder of legitimate royal heirs and the psychological destruction of thousands of children who were treated as experimental subjects rather than human beings. The conversation between Cardinal Albani and Lady Catherine was interrupted by the arrival of another figure who would change everything. Dr. Edward Jenner, the physician who would later become famous for developing the smallpox vaccine, entered the nursery carrying a leather satchel that contained documents he claimed would expose the entire Vatican conspiracy. Dr. Jenner's involvement in the baby swapping investigation had begun 2 years earlier, when he noticed unusual patterns in infant mortality rates among English noble families. His medical training had taught him to recognize signs of deliberate poisoning, and he had become suspicious when he observed that royal children seemed to die at convenient moments for potential successors. The documents in Dr. Jenner's satchel contained evidence that would revolutionize understanding of the baby swapping conspiracy. He had managed to obtain copies of Vatican breeding records that detailed the genetic selection criteria used for choosing replacement children. The records revealed that the Vatican had been conducting what amounted to eugenic experiments for over a century, treating human reproduction as a scientific discipline rather than a natural process. The breeding records also revealed the true fate of displaced royal children. Contrary to Cardinal Albani's claims, most of these children had not been eliminated immediately after the switches. Instead, they had been relocated to remote facilities where they were used as control subjects in psychological experiments designed to understand the difference between natural royal behavior and artificially conditioned aristocratic mannerisms. These experiments were conducted with the clinical detachment of modern scientific research. The displaced royal children were subjected to various forms of psychological and physical stress, while Vatican researchers observed their responses and compared them to the behavior of the replacement children who had taken their places. The goal was to develop more effective conditioning techniques that could create more convincing false royals. The psychological impact on the experimental subjects was devastating. Many of the displaced children developed severe mental illness as a result of their treatment, while others died from the physical stress of the experiments. The Vatican researchers viewed these casualties as acceptable losses in pursuit of their larger scientific goals. Dr. Jenner's investigation had also uncovered evidence of Vatican involvement in baby swapping operations that extended far beyond Europe. The Church had established similar programs in Asia, where Catholic missionaries were using genetic manipulation techniques to create false royal bloodlines among converted populations. The goal was to establish Catholic monarchies that would serve as beachheads for Vatican expansion into traditionally non-Christian territories. The most disturbing discovery in Dr. Jenner's documents concerned the Vatican's plans for the future. The Church was apparently developing techniques for genetic manipulation that would allow them to create entirely artificial human beings, creatures that would combine the best characteristics of multiple bloodlines while possessing absolute loyalty to Vatican authority. These artificial beings would be created through a combination of selective breeding, surgical modification, and chemical treatments that could alter fundamental aspects of human physiology. The Vatican believed that these creatures would represent the next stage of human evolution, superior to natural humans in every measurable way, while remaining completely subservient to church authority. The theological implications of these experiments were staggering. The Vatican was essentially attempting to play God, creating new forms of human life that would serve its political purposes while claiming divine authority for its actions. The contradiction between Christian teachings about the sanctity of human life and the Vatican's treatment of children as experimental subjects was so profound that it threatened to destroy the entire theoretical foundation of Catholic doctrine. Cardinal Albani's response to Dr. Jenner's revelations was chilling in its calm rationality. He explained that the Vatican viewed its genetic manipulation programs as acts of divine service, arguing that God had given the Church the knowledge and resources necessary to improve upon his original creation. The suffering of individual children was regrettable, but necessary for the greater good of creating a more perfect form of human civilization. The philosophical debate that followed between Cardinal Albani and Dr. Jenner revealed the fundamental moral questions raised by the baby swapping conspiracy. Was it acceptable to sacrifice individual children for the theoretical benefit of future generations? Did the Church have the right to manipulate human reproduction in service of political goals? Could any end justify the means being employed by the Vatican's genetic manipulation programs? Lady Catherine found herself caught between two worldviews that seemed equally compelling and equally horrifying. Cardinal Albani's vision of scientifically optimized humanity offered the possibility of eliminating the genetic defects and psychological instabilities that plagued natural royal bloodlines. But Dr. Jenner's evidence revealed that achieving this vision required treating human children as disposable experimental subjects. The debate was complicated by the fact that both men genuinely believed they were serving the greater good. Cardinal Albani saw himself as a visionary who was willing to make difficult moral choices for the benefit of future generations. Dr. Jenner viewed himself as a defender of traditional human values against scientific hubris that threatened to destroy the very concept of natural human dignity. The baby in the royal crib continued sleeping peacefully, unaware that his existence was at the center of a philosophical debate that would determine the future of human civilization. His every breath was the product of centuries of genetic manipulation and psychological conditioning, making him simultaneously the most artificial and most powerful human being in Europe. The documents Dr. Jenner had obtained also revealed the existence of other resistance movements that were working to expose the Vatican's baby swapping operations. These groups operated in complete secrecy, using coded communications and underground networks to share information about suspected switches, and coordinate efforts to protect legitimate royal heirs. The most effective resistance movement was apparently based in the German states, where Protestant theologians had developed techniques for identifying switched children through careful analysis of their behavioral patterns and physical characteristics. These German investigators had created a network of agents who monitored European royal courts, documenting evidence of baby swapping operations and working to expose the conspiracies. The resistance movements faced enormous challenges in their efforts to combat the Vatican conspiracy. The Church's resources were virtually unlimited. Its network of agents was incredibly sophisticated, and its willingness to use violence against opponents was well established. Many resistance members had been eliminated when they came too close to exposing major operations. The most successful resistance strategy involved creating alternative documentation systems that could preserve evidence of legitimate royal bloodlines, even when the official records had been falsified. These underground genealogical records were maintained by networks of scholars who risked their lives to preserve the truth about European royal succession. The psychological warfare between the Vatican and the resistance movements was as intense as any military conflict. Both sides used propaganda, disinformation, and psychological manipulation to advance their causes. The Vatican spread rumors about the mental instability of resistance members, while the resistance movements questioned the legitimacy of every major European royal family. The impact of this psychological warfare on European society was profound and lasting. The constant suspicion and paranoia created by the baby swapping conspiracy had destroyed public trust in royal authority and created a climate of uncertainty that made effective governance increasingly difficult. The very concept of legitimate rule had become questionable when no one could be certain which monarchs were actually entitled to their thrones. The conversation in the royal nursery was approaching its climax as Lady Catherine realised that she was being forced to choose not just between personal alternatives, but between competing visions of human civilization itself. Her decision would determine whether the Vatican's genetic manipulation programs would continue unchallenged, or whether the resistance movements would gain the evidence they needed to expose the entire conspiracy. The weight of this responsibility was crushing. Lady Catherine understood that her choice would affect not just her own son, but potentially millions of people who were being governed by false royals created through genetic manipulation and psychological conditioning. The future of European civilization hung in the balance, and she was the only person who could tip the scales in either direction. Cardinal Albani made one final offer that revealed the true desperation of the Vatican's position. He promised that if Lady Catherine agreed to serve as a Vatican agent, her son would not only be returned to her, but would be given a position in the church hierarchy that would eventually lead to his elevation as a cardinal. The Vatican was essentially offering to make her child one of the most powerful people in the Catholic world. The offer was tempting, not just because it would reunite Lady Catherine with her son, but because it would give her access to information that could eventually be used to expose the entire conspiracy from within. She could pretend to serve Vatican interests while actually working to document and reveal the truth about the baby swapping operations. Dr. Jenner recognized the strategic value of Lady Catherine's position and urged her to accept Cardinal Albani's offer. He explained that the resistance movements desperately needed an agent inside the Vatican hierarchy who could provide information about future operations and help protect potential victims of baby swapping. The plan that emerged from their whispered conversation was audacious in its scope and terrifying in its implications. Lady Catherine would become a double agent, pretending to serve Vatican interests while actually working to expose the genetic manipulation programs. Her son would be raised within the church hierarchy, giving him access to information that could eventually be used to destroy the entire conspiracy. The psychological toll of this deception would be enormous. Lady Catherine would be forced to participate in activities that she morally opposed, while her son would be raised in an environment that would attempt to mold him into a willing participant in the very system that had victimized his family. The long-term consequences of this psychological manipulation were impossible to predict. The immediate danger was equally significant. If Cardinal Albani or other Vatican agents suspected that Lady Catherine was working as a double agent, both she and her son would be eliminated without hesitation. The conspiracy had already demonstrated its willingness to murder innocent children, and it would not hesitate to kill adults who threatened its security. The meeting in the royal nursery ended with Lady Catherine's reluctant agreement to Cardinal Albani's proposal. She would serve as a Vatican agent while secretly working to expose the baby-swapping conspiracy. Her son would be returned to her, but only under carefully controlled circumstances that would ensure his continued loyalty to the Church. The baby in the royal crib continued sleeping peacefully, unaware that his future had been determined by a conversation that would reshape European history. The false prince would grow up to rule over millions of people who would never know that their monarch was the product of genetic manipulation and psychological conditioning rather than divine appointment. The conspiracy that had started with individual acts of baby swapping had evolved into something far more dangerous. A systematic attempt to replace natural human reproduction with scientific manipulation designed to serve political purposes. The Vatican's genetic experiments represented a fundamental challenge to traditional concepts of human dignity and natural law. The resistance movements that opposed these experiments faced enormous challenges in their efforts to expose the truth. The Vatican's resources were virtually unlimited. Its agents were incredibly sophisticated, and its willingness to use violence was well established. But the resistance members understood that they were fighting not just for political freedom, but for the very survival of natural human civilization. The philosophical questions raised by the baby-swapping conspiracy would echo through the centuries, influencing debates about genetic engineering, human experimentation, and the proper relationship between scientific advancement and moral responsibility. The children who had been switched were living embodiments of these questions, their very existence challenging traditional assumptions about the nature of human identity and the source of legitimate authority. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether the Vatican's vision of scientifically optimized humanity would triumph, or whether the resistance movements would succeed in preserving traditional concepts of natural human dignity. The outcome would depend on the actions of individuals like Lady Catherine, who had been forced to make impossible choices in a world where innocence itself had become a luxury that no one could afford. The baby-swapping conspiracy had created a situation where every European royal family was potentially fraudulent, every act of governance was potentially illegitimate, and every citizen was potentially being ruled by an impostor. The very foundations of European civilization had been undermined by a conspiracy that treated human children as experimental subjects in a vast program of genetic manipulation designed to serve the political ambitions of a single religious institution. The revolution that would expose these conspiracies was about to begin, and its consequences would be more far-reaching than anyone could have imagined. The children who had been switched were coming of age, and some of them were beginning to ask questions that would unravel centuries of carefully constructed lies about the nature of royal authority and the source of legitimate government. As we've seen throughout history, the practice of swapping royal babies created some of the most dramatic and consequential deceptions ever recorded, with entire kingdoms hanging in the balance of these carefully orchestrated lies. These weren't just palace gossip or romantic fiction, but real events that shaped the course of European history, destroyed lives, and toppled dynasties. The next time you hear about royal succession or bloodline legitimacy, remember that behind the golden crowns and ceremonial pageantry lie these dark secrets of switched identities and stolen birthrights. If you found these shocking true stories as fascinating as I did, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because next week we're diving into another royal scandal that will completely change how you view medieval monarchy. Trust me, what you're about to discover about the secret marriages of English royalty will make today's revelations seem tame by comparison.